All right. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, this talk is going to be a little bit longer than 3 minutes. So if you watched that competition last year, buckle up for, a little bit more of a deeper understanding of the task at hand. My name is Andrew Hawks, as Tom already mentioned, and I'm going to be speaking about performing masculinity in Calgary, Alberta during the Great War. On the evening of August 4th, 1914, as the citizens of Calgary waited with mixed feelings of hope and dread to see how Germany would respond to Great Britain's ultimatum, the air was hot and choked with smoke from nearby forest fires. If Germany did not withdraw from Belgium by 4 o'clock Calgary time, a state of war would exist. The crowd in Calgary included thousands of young men, many of whom would soon be overseas in France. As the deadline passed, Calgarians burst into song and cheered the fact that finally decisive action had been taken. War, some members of the crowd believed, would be terrible, but at the very least, it would, quote, clear up a lot of things. As the blood-red summer moon rose in the sky, the citizens of Calgary continued their revelry. An article in the Calgary Herald drew parallels between the forest fire smoke and the, quote, smoke of battlefields, in which Canadians too shall take their place by the side of their brothers across the sea, in the defense of liberty and in opposition to tyrannic domination. The idea that men from Calgary would fail to rise to the occasion was not considered. Today I will be discussing hegemonic masculinity in Calgary, Alberta during the Great War. My research is most concerned with uncovering how men's individual masculine identities aligned with the ideals of the time in which they lived. The subjects of this presentation are English Canadian men from Calgary. By and large, they were recent immigrants from Ontario, Britain, and the United States. They also represented the dominant class of individuals in Calgary in 1914. The first section of this lecture defines key terms such as hegemonic masculinity, identifies the books that were particularly influential in my research, and contextualizes the state of masculinity in Calgary on the eve of the Great War. In the second section, I will explore how newspaper coverage of battalion departure parades entrenched masculine expectations that existed in Calgary before the first shots in Europe were fired. In the third section, I will analyze the letters that men wrote to their loved ones during the war and the different ways that men performed masculinity in their writing. Finally, in the fourth section, I will compare the masculine performances and letters to the identities that men crafted in post-war memoirs to illustrate the enduring appeal of the hegemonic masculine model that existed during the Great War. By the end of the next roughly 45 minutes, you will find that my research has several broad conclusions. I argue that the masculine identities men performed in their letters and in their memoirs were impacted by their wartime experience, but they were also shaped by hegemonic standards of masculinity entrenched in Western society by the early 20th century. The war did not prompt a reconstruction of masculinity. Rather, it encouraged a more militant and physical masculine model that had been increasing in popularity for decades before the conflict began. Although subjective masculine identities were more nuanced and convoluted than the normative ideal depicted in newspapers, the men that appear in this study largely embodied hegemonic masculinity. Calgary men were adherents to a masculine model that promoted service to the empire, adventurous actions, and physical frontier living, while rejecting domesticity as soft and feminine. Individual men crafted masculine identities in their letters home and in their memoirs that emphasized their adherence to this hegemonic conception of masculinity, even as their personal experiences overseas challenged traditional notions of bravery, physical strength, and emotional control. To make sure that everyone is on the same page here and to establish the theoretical framework that my research uses to analyze the topic of masculinity, two very important terms must be clearly defined. The first is the term masculinity, which is a word I'm going to be saying a lot today, so if it starts to sound, over repetitive, I'm really sorry in advance. I tried my best. The way that I've approached masculinity is predicated on the work of noted scholars of gender, such as Judith Butler, R.W. Connell, and John Tosh. This conceptual definition of masculinity and the framework of hegemonic masculinity is largely drawn from their work. There is no universal and timeless definition of masculinity that includes an innate set of traits, values, and behavior that is quintessentially male. Historians of masculinity have demonstrated that in different time periods and geographical spaces, there are varying definitions of what it means to be a man. Masculinity, like any gender identity, is performative in the sense that it requires the continual performance of masculine actions. For example, in the early 20th century, the term manliness became popular to refer to masculine behavior. The entire concept of manliness, for example, the fact that men can have varying degrees of manliness, illustrates that boys do not become men simply by aging. Masculinity is dependent on acquiring and exhibiting a variety of qualities and competencies that society defines as manly. Masculinity is also a relational concept. That means it is defined in relation to other gender identities. So feminine traits are not masculine and vice versa, but it also means that it is defined by human relations. Masculine actions are those that are recognized as masculine by others. Finally, masculinity is a public identity. It is confirmed through repeated demonstrations of masculine behavior. Public action can be something simple, like wearing pants, or it can be more complex, like being the family breadwinner. But above all, it is important to note that masculinity is not just a set of traits that men inevitably exhibit, nor is it timeless and unchanging. Now, hegemonic masculinity is a theoretical framework for studying the subject coined by R.W. Connell in her 1983 book, Masculinities. The theory argues that in a given time and space, there are competing definitions of masculinity, but that there is a dominant conception that occupies the hegemonic position. It is particularly useful for analyzing men's relations with other men because it accounts for multiple masculinities and recognizes that not all men adhere equally to what society defines as masculine behavior. Hegemonic masculinity is not necessarily maintained by force. It is not imposed on people from the outside. Rather, it emerges from the interactions of people with other individuals, social institutions, and cultural texts. It isn't defined by how the majority of men actually behave. It is ultimately an ideal. The fact that people strive to attain it is a measure of its hegemony. For instance, professional athletes are masculine icons for many young men, despite the fact that they make up a very small percentage of the male population. In 1914, military service was tightly linked to the dominant masculine ideal across Britain and her dominions. War was held as an opportunity for masculine attainment where real men were made, and where hegemonic masculine traits like emotional control, physical toughness, and stoicism were nurtured. In part, militarized masculinity ascended to the hegemonic position because in the early 20th century, masculinity was in crisis. Modern industrial living conditions and vocal women's rights movements undermined men's claim to power and increased masculine self-doubt. Urbanization and industrialization, accompanied by its manifestations of poverty, health concerns, and perceived moral degradation, resulted in a widespread concern that men were becoming weak and lazy. Throughout the Victorian era leading up to the Great War, as John Tosh argues, there was a shift from the earnest, expressive manliness of the evangelicals to the hearty, stiff upper lip variant in the era of Kitchener and Baden-Powell. The hegemonic masculine figure was the warrior, who ventured abroad on behalf of the empire and took hardship in stride with enthusiasm and vigor. I want to briefly highlight some of the works in particular that guided my research. Jessica Meyer's Men of War analyzed British soldiers and their masculine performances in a variety of mediums, including letters, diaries, and personal memoirs. Michael Roper's The Secret Battle focuses on British soldiers' emotional survival during the war through correspondence with their mothers. Joanna Bourke's Dismembering the Male is a study of British soldiers during the Great War and the connections between normative masculinity and the physical body. Finally, Mark Moss's Manliness and Militarism establishes ties between masculinity, imperialism, and the social and educational environment in Ontario before the Great War. It provides useful contextual info about hegemonic masculinity in Canada. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are just some of the highlights from my research for this topic. Now, these are all works that very skillfully analyze the male experience of the Great War, but you'll notice that very few of them are Canadian. In the Canadian historiography of gender in the Great War, there is a major gap where general studies of masculinity during the war would fit. Broad studies of masculinity in the Great War have been conducted in many other combatant nations. In Canada, there are many works about the Great War that touch on masculinity as part of their analysis, and there are lots of works that deal with masculinity in a Canadian context on either side of the Great War. But there are few works that deal specifically with masculinity during the war, particularly at the level of the individual. At the end of her dissertation on conceptions of masculinity in Toronto during the Great War, which is one of the exceptions to this rule, Mary Georgina Chaksiris calls for more research that takes into account the autobiographical experience of men during the war and their individual masculine identities. This project has been an attempt to answer that call and take a small step towards a comprehensive study of Canadian men and masculinity during the Great War. It builds on the tried and tested frameworks developed by Jessica Meyer and Michael Roper, along with others who have conducted research on men's masculinity during the war. Before we go any further, I want to briefly set the scene by describing the social fabric of Calgary immediately before the war. In 1914, Calgary was a city that had undergone several decades of rapid demographic, economic, and social change. Many of the inhabitants were new to Canada, and nearly all of them were new to Alberta. In the next 15 years, in the 1901 census, Calgary's population was just under 5,000 people. In the next 15 years, it grew dramatically. From 1906 to 1911, the population grew from just under 14,000 to nearly 44,000. It tripled in just 5 years. Throughout Calgary's development into a major regional urban center, it remained a city dominated by British Canadian culture, even as its economic makeup became more industrialized and its population exploded. The quote you see here from a visiting reporter for the London Times remained true as the city grew. As Calgary's population rose, it became a bastion for British immigrants to Canada that found themselves unable or unwilling to cultivate land effectively in the harsh homesteading atmosphere of rural Alberta. Given the surplus of horses, polo became a popular sport in Calgary. Local churches and prominent buildings were built in the architectural style of Victorian England. In the 1916 census, 35% of Calgary's population was born in the British Isles. Calgary had a proportion of British inhabitants that was 2 times larger than the rest of Alberta. These demographics are important because they shaped the hegemonic masculine model that became prominent in the city. Newcomers to Calgary faced pressure to assimilate into masculine identities that emphasize self-control, honor, stoicism, and duty. Calgary's local institutions were venues where regional hegemonic masculine models were supported and developed. The city stood at the forefront of the expansion of the British Empire, and local middle-class reformers sought to improve upon the British culture that had created it. As Calgary experienced unprecedented levels of growth, institutions such as the militia, cadet programs, and extracurricular groups such as the Boy Scouts and the Boys Brigade that supported a martial version of hegemonic masculinity became more popular. These institutions demonstrate that Calgary was receptive to British masculine ideals and reflect the fact that its citizens understood themselves as active actors in the empire, not as distinctly Western Canadian individuals. At the beginning of the Great War in 1914, hegemonic masculinity in Calgary paralleled late Victorian English codes of manliness. Manly qualities included, quote, forthrightness, vigorous physical activity, chivalry, courage, ambition, toughness, pluck, sacrifice, and self-reliance. Now, having established the theoretical framework of hegemonic masculinity, and more specifically the state of masculinity in Calgary immediately before the Great War, I turn now to the second section of this lecture that deals with battalion departure parades. What was a battalion departure parade? From August 1914 to January 1916, the authorized size of the Canadian Expeditionary Force grew from 30,000 men to 500,000 men. Local networks and resources were mobilized to recruit ever-increasing numbers of men into battalions for overseas service. These locally raised battalions were regarded as homegrown entities that demonstrated Calgary's commitment to the Empire. When the 56th Battalion, or commonly known as Calgary's Own, left, the Herald wrote that the city had, quote, given another pledge of its loyalty to the Crown and its undying allegiance to the cause of empire. Parades were popular social events before the Great War that brought people together and provided entertainment. Calgary had large parades for Victoria Day and the coronation of King George V, but they were also the default public celebration for a variety of social causes. Parades in the Great War were accompanied by other events like civic farewells and the presentation of colors. Battalion departure parades had 2 main practical functions. First, they enabled the transport of troops from their barracks in the city to the CPR station to board trains bound for harbors in eastern Canada. In Calgary, troops were quartered at the Victoria Barracks on the exhibition grounds, the modern-day site of the Stampede, until June 1915, when SSHRC camp was built on the corner of the Tsutina Reserve in southwest Calgary. Second, they gave family and friends an opportunity to wish the men well and say goodbye. Parades took central routes through downtown that maximized the visibility of the procession en route to the trains at the CPR depot. Now, that's a parade on a practical level. They were a popular social event that transported troops from point A to point B, and they allowed the family and friends of soldiers bound for overseas service to see them off. On a theoretical level, departure parades were social rituals. Rituals, according to Eric Hobsbawm, are invented traditions that legitimize institutions, status, or relations of authority and reinforce beliefs, value systems, and conventions of behavior. Robert Rotherdale has analyzed departure parades during the Great War in 3 different cities across Canada and concluded that in terms of masculinity, they, quote, elevated the myth of the volunteer, military masculinity, and imperial nationalism through the media of local spaces and local sites. Myth, in this case, shouldn't be taken to mean that militarized masculinity was imposed in a top-down manner by elites to indoctrinate the masses. That denies the agency of the thousands of Calgarians who freely flocked to attend battalion departure parades, and demonstrated that the quote-unquote myths that they legitimized were widely popular and had broad cultural support. There were 2 main ways that departure parades legitimized and entrenched hegemonic masculinity. Recall briefly the core elements of masculinity from the definition slide. It requires public actions, and it is defined by societal acceptance. These 2 elements were reinforced by the stage spectacle of the parade and the ensuing newspaper coverage. Parades specifically and publicly delineated the difference between militarized men participating in the parade and the public, who took every opportunity to show their affection for the men who had aligned with masculine ideals. Parades provided a forum where public praise could be awarded to the men in uniform carrying out their duty. Furthermore, they included military bands that played popular songs which increased public enthusiasm. The men themselves also engaged in popular call and response chants that increased crowd participation. A popular one in this instance was the "Are we downhearted?" and then the crowd would respond no. It kind of gets everyone involved and swept up in the general enthusiasm of the event. These elements increase the effectiveness of parades as a means of legitimizing the soldier hero as a hegemonic masculine ideal. Parades did not create support for the war or the soldier as a model of hegemonic masculinity, but they did encourage it through stage spectacles and crowd engagement. Newspaper coverage of these parades illustrates that they were highly successful events for celebrating the masculine nature of men in uniform. Newspapers and local officials praised the men involved in departure parades. At the first parade of soldiers in Calgary, the Herald wrote that the men were under the obligation of, quote, manhood and love of justice and home. As the last full battalion of men left Calgary, Senator James Lougheed made a speech to the men and civilians assembled, where he said, any man physically fit who refuses to respond to the call of his country is unworthy the name of manhood. Articles praised the enthusiasm of civilians who assembled to watch the parades, which reinforced the men's decision to enlist as masculine behavior. At the departure of the 31st Battalion, the Calgary Albertan estimated that 5,000 people lined the streets. At the departure of the 137th Battalion, the Calgary Herald wrote that the crowds were so dense that, quote, the train cars were fairly swallowed up. People hung on to them like swarming bees. You can see in these photos here the crowds that sort of gathered for these departure parades. In particular, there was an emphasis on women's support for the men in uniform that further affirmed the soldier as a masculine ideal. One example is from the Calgary Herald, which wrote that, quote, hundreds of the fair sex were out, dressed in their daintiest costumes to bid the boys farewell, and that hundreds of sweethearts waited at the station until the last train car had disappeared. Throughout the war, the staged spectacle of departure parades and the enthusiastic crowds that greeted them celebrated men in uniform as the living embodiments of hegemonic masculinity. But what does it actually mean to embody hegemonic masculinity? In other words, if you were the male ideal during the war, how were you described? Newspaper coverage of men on their way overseas was remarkably consistent. It described men as enthusiastic, emotionally reserved, brave and physically strong with the ability to endure hardship. Men in the parade were highlighted for their enthusiasm to get overseas and do their part. They were described as in control of their emotions, in contrast to the women and children in the crowd that couldn't help tearing up. Men were expected to be brave. At the departure of the 56th Battalion, the head of Military District 13 noted, quote, some of you will fall. I hope you will fall in the proper way with your bayonets pointed forward and your faces to the foe. The most apparent masculine aspect of the men on parade, according to newspaper reports, was their physical masculinity. The body is significant as it is the bedrock of normative masculinity, which provides men with the ability to enact masculine practices and habits. Physical appearance was the most visible indication of masculinity. It formed the basis for how a man's inner masculine qualities were judged by other men. The soldiers who left Calgary were highly praised for their masculine physical appearance. A sampling of newspaper articles illustrates that men were described using words such as, quote, stalwart, hardy, rough and ready, sturdy, fit as fiddles and hard as nails, bronze young giants, and suntanned warriors. Their physical quality was described as a product of the environment in which they lived, despite the fact that many of these men were only several years removed from Britain. The 137th Battalion was described as a group of, quote, sturdy Westerners, and the 12th Canadian Mounted Rifles was expected to be a good cavalry unit because they were, quote, bred in the ranging foothills and brought up in the open. The men who marched through Calgary were those who aligned most closely with the hegemonic model of masculinity at the time. However, they were still individuals. As Mark Moss argues in his book, quote, if we forget that individuals, regardless of their origins, are capable actors in their history who are aware of what they are doing, and if we view all of society as one homogeneous mass dominated by institutions, great men, or structures, then central components of past experiences are nullified or at the least relegated to the fringes. It is to these individuals that we now turn to interrogate to what degree they accepted, rejected, or renegotiated the hegemonic masculine ideal that they were purported to represent. I want to turn now to the third section of this lecture concerning the ways that men performed masculinity in their letters home during the war. Men overseas wrote home frequently. The Canadian Army Postal Service handled 1.3 million letters a week in 1918. They wrote so often because letters were practically the only way of staying in touch with loved ones who remained at home. Letters were owed to family members who routinely wrote to the men in the trenches. Two humorous examples can illustrate the high rate of correspondence that men were expected to uphold. In a postscript in a letter to his brother, Fred Turner definitively underlined the sentence, quote, this was my 14th letter today, so good night. He had clearly had an exhausting day. Harold McGill struggled to appease his wife's desire for contact. He pleaded in a letter, quote, please remember, dear, that it is not always very easy for me to get off a letter. I have written to you every day since the unit came out of the line. That's pretty fair, isn't it? Letter writing provided relief during lengthy periods of inactivity and boredom that were characteristic of the Great War. As much as men may have struggled to keep up with their correspondence, they had the same desire for letters from home because it gave them a link to the life they had left behind. Soldiers hungered for mail, and news was greatly appreciated. Mail deliveries were eagerly anticipated, and delays were abhorred. Letters from the front acted as the primary connection between men at war and their loved ones at home. As a conduit for men's emotions, these letters provide insight into their masculinity. There were two main masculine identities that emerged from my analysis of Calgary's men's letters during the Great War: the martial and the domestic. Martial masculinity was hegemonic. It was the specific traits, values, and actions that were elevated to the status of hegemonic masculinity in wartime society. These were defined as natural and inherent qualities of manhood. It was the model of masculinity that was celebrated in newspaper coverage of battalion departures. Domestic masculinity was about protecting and providing for the family at home. It refers to the aspects of masculinity that predated men's military service. Men were fathers, husbands, and sons long before they put on the uniform. Although men did not abandon their domestic identities entirely in their letters home, they routinely performed and emphasized the ways in which they aligned with the martial masculine ideal overseas. There's an inherent tension between these two concepts, because men struggled with a desire to describe their experience and confide in their loved ones, with gendered expectations to remain emotionally reserved and stoic about conditions at the front. When discussing the two main masculine identities, it is important to note that letters are representations of self. Their application to the real lives of the men who wrote them is tough to establish. What I mean by that is, for example, many men claimed that they were not afraid in combat or downplayed the fear that they were admitted to. Whether they were actually afraid or not is largely irrelevant. It is the implication of conveying bravery or a lack of fear that is important to establishing the masculine identity that they formulated in their letters. Similarly, how letter writers discussed other men is relevant for determining their subjective conceptions of masculinity, regardless of how factually accurate their observations were. For instance, if a man condemned another man for avoiding frontline service, it indicates that he regarded frontline service as a masculine duty, whether or not the other man was actually avoiding the front line. Men indicated their adherence to martial masculine codes of conduct in two major ways. They express admiration for actions that aligned with hegemonic ideals, and they condemn men who failed to adhere to these ideals. Martial masculinity was part of the essence of a man who had served at the front, but it required the consistent performance of masculine actions and values. The concept of duty was a major aspect of men's letters. Duty was defined by established principles of masculinity in schools, social clubs, and boys' literature. It appeared in men's letters as a code by which men ought to live and a justification for the actions they undertook to exhibit martial masculinity. Men in their letters remained enthusiastic to fight, similarly to how they were described in newspaper coverage of battalion departure parades. This remained consistent throughout the war, despite the proliferation of news that emphasized the death and destruction of modern warfare, but it was most common in the letters of men who had already enlisted, but who had not yet seen combat. Another aspect of men's letters that closely aligned with the masculine ideal was their depiction of army life as a positive development for their physical masculinity. Frederick Knights wrote, quote, "I have gained 18 pounds in weight since I left Calgary, but in muscle, not in fat." While Eric Harvey wrote, "I have never felt better in my life, nor weighed so much." Because letters were written for domestic audiences, violence was not generally discussed. Aggression was largely sublimated into the rhetoric of suffering. In this context, masculine performance required a stoic response to discomfort and danger. Men downplayed the effects of artillery bombardments on their nerves and commented on the ability of their comrades to control their emotions and endure dangerous combat conditions. A careful reading of letters indicates how they were documents in which masculine identities were performed. For men in uniform writing home, frontline service was a requirement of martial masculinity. Men wrote about their anxiety to get to the front, do their duty, and make a difference. Once a man reached the front, he judged those around him by the length of time that they had spent at the front. Consider the case of Thomas Riley. Now, Thomas Riley can objectively be considered an ideal man by wartime standards of masculinity. And you might think that I'm just sort of making that up. You know, it's a good example to cherry pick here. But listen to this. Thomas Riley was 5'10" with an athletic physique. In 1915, his last year at the Anglican public school, Bishop Pinkham College, he won awards for academic achievement, athletic feats, and a medal for manliness. Thomas Riley enlisted when he turned 18 in the spring of 1916. In December of that year, he was absorbed into the 19th Reserve Battalion in England as a corporal. From December 1916 to April 1917, Thomas Riley stayed in England, completing various additional training courses and waiting to be assigned to a draft of men for a battalion on the continent. Because of the manpower requirements of the Canadian Expeditionary Force in France, Riley was passed over. Due to high casualty rates and turnover, the Army needed privates and lieutenants in 1917, but they had no need for acting corporals with no frontline experience. Thomas Riley grew increasingly frustrated. He wrote to his parents and complained, quote, "All the best men are going over to France on the drafts, and I don't want to be left here with the misfits." In March, he said that he was, quote, "very much fed up with sticking around in the country." And at the beginning of April, Thomas Riley wrote, "You don't know what it is to see your best pals going away on a draft while you have to stick around doing things you knew how to do a year ago. You feel like a quitter, and it would certainly be rotten to go back to Canada without getting to France." 19 days later, Thomas Riley reverted to the rank of private in order to join a draft for the 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles in France. He was killed in action 6 months later at the Battle of Passchendaele. In letters from the front, men clearly outlined how they adhered to the martial masculine ideal by carrying out their duty, enthusiastically serving overseas, becoming physically stronger, and stoically reacting to the dangers of frontline service. These principles were further affirmed in men's letters by the disdain with which men regarded those who transgressed the hegemonic norm. This method of determining masculine expectations is best explained by Judith Allen, who writes, quote, "It is the drawing of boundaries which illuminates that inside of the circle." One prominent example of how masculine norms were revealed through criticism is indicated by soldiers' comments about their comrades who avoided frontline service. Men overseas, engaged in active combat positions, were particularly derisive towards other men who had enlisted but sought safer jobs or avoided the front line. These jobs were called bomb-proof or safety-first jobs, and they were widely regarded as evidence that the man in question lacked courage. James Brown wrote, quote, "There is nothing I detest more than the men who enlist and look for safety-first jobs. It would be much more manly for them to not enlist at all than sail under false colors." By deploring men who transgress martial masculine expectations, men overseas confirmed in their letters the specific requirements of wartime hegemonic masculinity, as well as their personal adherence to the masculine ideal. As much as men reaffirmed principles of hegemonic masculinity during the war, their experiences overseas also pushed them to their limits. In some ways, the masculine ideal was subtly redefined to accommodate the destabilizing and disillusioning effect of modern warfare. There was a shift during the war regarding the concept of fear and bravery in the masculine ideal. Before the war, to lack fear was to be masculine. Bravery was the absence of fear, or in other words, a man had to have nerve. This pre-war understanding of bravery was tested by the fact that fear was felt by virtually everyone overseas. The prevalence of fear, even among men who considered themselves brave, prompted a renegotiation of hegemonic masculine expectations. Rather than having nerve, men were expected to have nerves under control. The ideal was a man who certainly experienced fear, but was able to control himself despite his fear and remain a functioning frontline soldier. There are numerous examples of this in men's letters home, but the most clear example is from a letter Arthur Turner received from a friend at the front who wrote, quote, "Don't be ashamed if you feel frightened. Everybody is, whether they admit it or not, but don't show it. What the hell's the use? If you're going to get it, you'll get it." Note the reassertion of stoicism that went hand in hand with the acceptance that fear was an emotion that men felt. Throughout the war, men's ability to control their emotions was tested. One example of a moment of emotional distress comes from a series of letters between Harold McGill and his wife. At the Battle of Courcelette, Harold McGill's closest friend and devoted stretcher-bearer, Teddy Barnes, was killed after his leg was torn off by shrapnel. McGill was present for the death, which he relayed to his wife in painstaking detail. At the end of this letter, McGill wrote that saying goodbye to Barnes made him, quote, "feel like a baby. I could very easily have made a fool of myself." In his next letter home, McGill apologized to his wife. He wrote, "You would think that a frightfully blue letter of mine. I felt ashamed of it after I sent it off." McGill felt internalized pressure to control his emotions, both at the death of Barnes and in his subsequent letters home. An event like this could have very easily shaken his perception of masculinity, but actually, McGill reasserted his understanding of emotional control as a masculine behavior. A year later, he recalled that the day Barnes died, he had, quote, "an idea what a woman meant when she said she felt like having a good cry." McGill viewed his emotional fragility as an instance of femininity, not as an alternative expression of masculinity. His rationalization of his emotional weakness as femininity rather than masculinity is an indication of the strength of hegemonic masculine principles during the war. As prevalent as martial masculinity was in men's letters home, they did not entirely abandon their domestic identities. Protecting the family, according to the martial masculine ideal, was what the men were doing overseas in the first place, fighting for king and country. However, in letters home, protecting the family in a much more literal sense meant downplaying the danger that men faced overseas and assuring anxious loved ones that things would be all right. This was a phenomenon in virtually every single letter. It was widely prevalent. Men writing to their siblings asked them not to tell their parents specific details about injuries or trench raids that could cause them to worry. Letters were commonly ended with several sentences that implored the recipient not to worry, as the sender was in perfect safety far away from the guns. As Harold McGill somewhat dubiously told his wife, "I am in no more danger of being injured here than I should be of being run over by a taxi or bus in London." In order to protect their loved ones in letters, men had to downplay the danger that they faced. They modified the content of their letters in ways that clashed directly with their efforts to perform martial masculinity. This illustrates the fact that although domestic and martial masculine identities somewhat coexisted, they clashed with one another and they were not always compatible. Men had to balance the concerns and considerations of their domestic audience with their efforts to perform martial masculinity and demonstrate that they were effective soldiers. They wrote about the ways that they tried to make the trenches feel like home, or about different domestic duties they had adopted out of necessity. Acknowledging an alternative to hegemonic martial masculinity in men's letters home does not illustrate that these men rejected normative masculine expectations. Rather, it illustrates the depth and nuance of subjective masculine identities relative to the hegemonic standard. Just going to grab a sip of water here. In Calgary men's letters, martial masculine principles were embraced and promoted. These principles remained prominent even as their understanding of warfare evolved. Men wrote about the importance of duty, their enthusiasm to fight, and the physical benefits of military service. They affirmed their willingness to control their emotions and hide their fears. By fighting at the front, enduring dangerous conditions, and stoically facing the enemy, men asserted that they were up to the task of performing martial masculinity. As the war progressed, men overseas remained enthusiastic in their letters home and vehemently condemned those who avoided frontline service and shirked their masculine duty. However, the war also stressed the masculine ideal. Wartime letters could be therapeutic processes where men lowered their masculine guard and leaned on their families for support. Their experience of war did not simply strengthen the pre-existing ideal. Men downplayed the danger that they faced and slipped back into domestic masculine expectations that predated the war. Subjective gender identities did not solely align with one definition of masculinity in perpetuity. The existence of domestic identities in men's letters, even as they sought to emphasize their adherence to heroic masculinity, indicates that subjective experiences did not reflect idealized masculine expectations. No man perfectly embodied hegemonic martial masculinity, despite the fact that many of them were vocal proponents of the importance of duty, bravery, and emotional suppression. The martial masculine model depicted in memoirs was very similar to letters, with more description, a greater degree of anecdotes, and a better overall narrative quality. It required less reading between the lines to determine how the writing related to men's masculine identity. Enthusiasm and duty were virtually unchanged from wartime letters. As you can see from this Harold McGill quote, military service was viewed as the natural male reaction to war. The masculinizing effect of the army, particularly on men's physical bodies, was still touted. Harvey Duncan recalled, "Work parties were tiresome, but actually, I felt well and strong. It was a hardy life." Bravery and courage under fire were emphasized as highly desirable traits. Memoir writers sought to demonstrate that their own service required bravery, and they celebrated at length the brave acts of other men that they knew. Finally, frontline service was still upheld as the mark of true masculinity. Men condemned those they knew who avoided spending time at the front and sought safer jobs. The importance of frontline service was apparent in memoirs, even when it was not explicitly written down. Men wrote about chances to take safer jobs in the rear that they declined, or only begrudgingly accepted. For instance, in Victor Wheeler's memoir, he wrote about the fact that he was offered a safe position as a counselor at a YMCA camp in Caillou. He declined because, in his words, quote, "Facing death with my buddies preferred to and was more self-respecting than simply looking like a soldier while my comrades were fighting." There was a difference in the eyes of the men who wrote these memoirs between being a soldier and just looking like one. The basic model of martial masculinity developed in memoirs was remarkably similar to wartime letters. However, there are some key differences between memoirs and letters. The differences largely stem from the fact that memoirs were more consciously created documents that were written for a general audience rather than an intimate family audience. Writing a memoir is a process of creating linear stories from disjointed memories that satisfies a need to remember. They tell us what it was like for this man in his war. Because they were created after the war was finished, they gave men the time and space to construct a coherent narrative that reflected on their wartime experiences. They are generally more reflective about the emotional experience of war. Domesticity and domestic masculinity are largely absent from memoirs, as they focus less on men's connection to home and more on their experiences overseas. Toughness was an attribute discussed at length in memoirs, as men no longer felt the same pressure during the wartime to hide their injuries from loved ones. In memoirs, injuries were proof that men had endured dangerous fighting conditions and persevered. They were a testament to their masculine prowess. Men highlighted events where they persevered through pain and injury despite overwhelming odds, particularly if those injuries related to combat. They also praised the men around them who were able to remain in the line or who made it back to the line after suffering gruesome injuries. It's important to note that enduring injuries and acting tough in memoirs was largely restricted to activities that fit into the heroic ideal, such as combat. Other activities that were just as essential but much less recognized, such as working parties to repair trenches, were commonly avoided by the men. The other aspect of memoirs that largely differed from letters was the degree to which men could expand on the emotions that they felt during the war. Men were much more explicit about the emotions that they felt once they did not have to account for their loved ones in retelling. What emerges in their writing is a better sense of the stress that military service put on their ability to continue to perform masculinity. Men highlighted a variety of factors that caused them to feel fear, including trips into no man's land and shell fire. Furthermore, they highlighted the cumulative effect that combat had on their nerves. In memoirs, men could freely admit the toll that military service took on their physical and mental health, relative to the letters. However, just because men were able to discuss fear and stress more freely in their memoirs didn't make those feelings necessarily fit into the hegemonic model. Men brought up the fear and stress that warfare inspired, in part to highlight the trying conditions which they had endured. In the same way that men admitted fear in letters but noted the ways that they controlled themselves, men in memoirs relayed the fear and stress which ultimately didn't prevent them from carrying out their duty. They still mocked those around them who exhibited fear, particularly those who lacked frontline service. It may seem contradictory to argue that memoirs allowed men to open up about their wartime experiences, and yet assert that the experiences did not significantly alter their subjective definition of ideal masculinity. To illustrate what I'm talking about, I want to discuss the topic of shell shock in memoirs. Shell shock was simultaneously held up as evidence of a man's failure to endure battlefield conditions, but also as an unfortunate fate of heroes, similar to other physical injuries that soldiers suffered. Men deplored the ways in which shell-shocked men failed to live up to masculine ideals, yet they were lenient with those that they personally knew who possessed a track record of masculine behavior. By modern mental health standards, it is estimated that 20% of all combat personnel had combat war neurosis, or as it was known at the time, shell shock. Men who suffered from shell shock were described in gendered terms. In the official history of Canada's medical services during the Great War, the condition was defined as a, quote, manifestation of childishness and femininity. Because shell shock resulted in a complete loss of self-control, it had dire implications for the masculine identity of the men who suffered from it. In some ways, memoirs perpetuated the contemporary understanding of shell shock to the letter, despite the fact that the men writing these memoirs had a greater understanding of combat and the mental stress that it incurred. Victor Wheeler, who had a brother that was actually hospitalized for shell shock in 1917, described shell shock victims as pathetic and raving maniacs. Donald Fraser recalled that shell-shocked men acted like little children. He singled out one middle-aged man reduced to tears by shelling as a, quote, pitiable object. In other ways, men's wartime experiences forced them to reevaluate their perception of the condition. In this reevaluation, while men became more sympathetic to shell shock, they also implicitly reasserted traditional hegemonic masculine values. Men were more accepting of shell shock when it occurred in others that they personally knew who had demonstrated their masculine prowess. By exhibiting bravery and courage on other occasions, shell shock could be explained as a temporary condition, similar to a physical injury of war. Some men went so far as to argue that shell shock could only manifest in brave men. I'd like to turn your attention to the quote by Harold McGill if you haven't read it already. Harold McGill was the medical officer for the 31st Battalion. He had contact with nearly all the men of the battalion who suffered from shell shock. His opinion was that the condition could only come about by lengthy exposure to artillery fire, which meant that only exceptionally courageous men who embodied the masculine ideal could suffer from the disease. It should be noted, however, that McGill viewed this as the true definition of shell shock. He still held that many men were simply using the condition as an excuse to avoid combat. Above all, the memoirs of Great War veterans from Calgary portray a desired and constructed image of their masculine selves. They prize masculine qualities such as enthusiasm, courage, duty, toughness, and physical strength. They demonstrate that the soldier hero as a hegemonic ideal survived the war, but it did not survive unchanged. Great War memoirs function as sources that reassert traditional hegemonic concepts of masculinity. In discussing why they fought, men emphasized that military service was a natural male duty, a unifying requirement amongst men. Their memoirs illustrate the intricacies of masculine ideals. Men were required to engage in frontline service, control their emotions, and be brave. At the same time, memoirs discuss how men and those around them failed to live up to these ideals. In the tension between the ideal and the lived reality, men's explanations and justifications for why they or others failed to live up to the standard were couched in language that asserted the primacy of hegemonic masculine ideals. Even as memoirs gave space for men to reflect on the fear, stress, and shock that their wartime service had entailed in reality, they also provided a forum in which writers criticized other men who failed to live up to lofty standards. In conclusion, my research analyzes conceptions of masculinity in Calgary during the Great War. During the years before the war, society viewed masculinity as physical, aggressive, and martial. In 1914, masculine codes urged men to be adventurous, courageous, stoic, emotionally reserved, physically fit, and patriotic. As the war began, the hegemonic masculinity of 1914 was put to the test. Nations had to mobilize unprecedented numbers of men for military service. Newspaper coverage of battalion departure parades in Calgary reinforced dominant masculine expectations. Battalion departure parades were ritualized celebrations of men who occupied the hegemonic position in gender hierarchies after 1914. They were celebrated for their physical attributes, courageous behavior, and emotional control as they paraded through the city. Martial music connected the men to the enthusiastic crowds that lined the streets. Even as the war devolved into a protracted struggle, military service remained the ultimate expression of masculinity. Enduring deadly conditions in the trenches became an indicator of courage, duty, and masculine vigor. However, local newspapers only reflect the masculine traits and values that were widely accepted in society. They indicate the common definition of words like manly and provide normative expectations for men. Alone, they are inadequate to build a model of hegemonic masculinity during the war. Letters from Calgary men serving overseas illustrate the differences and similarities between masculine expectations and individual conceptions of masculinity. Letters were a medium through which gender roles were performed, information was transmitted, and men remained in contact with their loved ones at home. Their efforts to protect their loved ones at the expense of cultivating a martial masculine identity illustrates that individual identities were more complex and nuanced than the hegemonic ideal. Veterans' memoirs written during and after the war further illustrate the enduring strength of wartime definitions of masculinity. Men performed masculinity in their memoirs. They highlighted the instances in which they upheld gendered expectations through bravery under fire, emotional control, endurance, and lengthy service on the front lines. Furthermore, they wrote at length about their comrades' adherence to masculine norms, particularly in combat situations and concerning their physical masculinity. However, memoirs also afforded men the time and space from the events they depicted to discuss subjects that did not align with hegemonic masculinity. The wartime soldier ideal was not dissected and destroyed in veterans' memoirs. It was celebrated and reinforced, even as post-war bitterness and disillusionment altered public understanding of the war. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. That's all I've got for here. I'd welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Really appreciate this fascinating topic. I'm wondering if you would mind stopping sharing so that everybody can sort of see us as we chat before we continue.
Yep, I can do that. If I can. Oh, there we go.
And just while you're doing that, I'm gonna start with a question from Megan. It's actually almost identical to one that I had written down, but I'm gonna give Megan credit for it so that Tom doesn't think I'm hogging the microphone again. So, your focus obviously is on Calgary, men from Calgary. Do you think that this is this notion of masculinity is can be sort of generalized across Canada, across the empire, or is there something special about the West and Calgary in particular?
Yeah, so it's a great question. R.W. Connell has a really good, so she's obviously the main, person who's created this sort of theory of hegemonic masculinity. And one of the things she talks about is that there are these overlapping sort of concepts. So there's like a global, there's a national, and then there's a local, or I think it's national, regional, local, whatever the buzzwords are. Basically, it speaks to the idea that is someone from Calgary going to be different from someone even from Edmonton or from London? No, like in the grand scheme of things, not really. One thing I found was Calgary is unique from a historical study aspect because it is a concentration of the kinds of masculine values that were widely prevalent everywhere else. So Calgary is unique in this aspect because just based on when it grew so much and based on where those people were coming from, it can be a really useful to see sort of a flashpoint of what were the cultural ideas regarding what men were. So that's why, and I talk a little bit about local institutions and just based on limitations of this talk, I can't really get into it a ton during it. But if you look at the numbers of like cadet enrollments and Boy Scout troop beginnings and Boys Brigade beginnings and all of those numbers, they all are skyrocketing in the 5 years before the war in Calgary, but also across Canada. It's skyrocketing across Canada, across the British Empire. Michael Adams has a really interesting book called The Great Adventure, where it's sort of more of a literary history, but he basically takes this same sort of concept of martial masculinity and he provides links between the United States and Britain in a common sort of literary past. So there is a clear indication that this is not necessarily just a Calgary thing or even just a Canada thing. It can be, widely generalized. Calgary is just nice because as a study, you can really get into the nuts and bolts of, it's really easy to say that, masculinity is military, but what's your actual evidence for that? And it's when you restrict it, you can really look at, well, okay, here are the organizations, here's what their charters say about men and masculinity and war, and here's their membership over, the 5 years preceding the war. So it's useful in that context, but definitely not unique.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you did a really nice job of really zeroing in while still offering that larger perspective. Um, I'm fascinated by the newspapers, um, and I wonder was how much of a central control was there on newspapers and sort of um, an approved message, if you will, that this is what we need to be telling the men so that we'll get them to sign up. Was that sort of a bigger picture, or was it just happened that this is what people were writing on?
Yes, so obviously, newspapers at this time generally are much more partisan than even some of the hyper partisan newspapers that you see today, right? In Calgary, there was the two main ones was the Calgary Albertan was sort of the liberal daily, and then the Calgary Herald was the conservative daily. So whenever they got into the political topics, you can clearly see lines where, you know, for instance, the Calgary Albertan is saying that if we don't ban alcohol, we're all going to hell in a handbasket. And the Calgary Herald at the same time is running articles about how prohibitionists are communists and, and obviously not communists, that hadn't really been, but, that kind of style of thinking, anti-government, they hate the war, they hate the men and whatever. But when it came down to sort of battalion departure parades and how that newspaper coverage came about, a lot of the research that I've done indicates that, like, while there is a degree of control from a top-down perspective, it's a lot more common to see sort of grassroots censorship. So what I mean by that is basically uh, and Jeff Keshin has written about this in Propaganda and Censorship, and Brock Millman has a really good book on censorship in Canada during the Great War. And basically, the notion is that there were large elements of English Canada that were so rabidly pro-war or so rabidly, in favor of prosecuting the war to the finish that official censorship never really had to take off that much, right? They didn't really necessarily, I would believe that, the head of whoever was writing these newspapers probably could have stepped in and said, well, we're going to explicitly praise these men in order to increase enlistments, but I don't think they would have had to. I think on some level, the desire to sell newspapers and the beliefs of the individual writers was sufficiently pro-war that they're going to come up with these sort of articles by themselves. But that being said, it is important to note that that's kind of why you have to separate newspaper coverage from uh, other other aspects of masculinity. Because of course, if you read those articles and you come away with the takeaway that, oh, well, I guess soldiers were more masculine than other men, you've misread, right? Like the source in this context, right? It's more important to say, well, what are they saying in this context rather than, how much does that reflect the reality of the men in uniform? So definitely a source that has to be read carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of picking up on that theme, you're I'm fascinated by this dichotomy between the martial masculinity and the domestic masculinity. Now, was um you're sort of you spoke mostly about domestic masculinity from the letters and then later on in the memoirs. Was that a big factor in the newspapers at all, or were they just focused on sort of this martial manliness in 1914?
Yeah, I'd say it's pretty much completely absent from newspapers. When domestic identities are sort of focused on it, it's more in the context of there were points in times where newspapers would relate what the men were doing in the context of the family. So, they're going overseas because they're protecting all of the families that are here. Um, but like in letters, for instance, you see really popular there's a great quote. I think it made it into the thesis, but it didn't make it into this presentation, where Harold McGill talks about how nobody understands that an officer's actual job overseas is basically, he doesn't say this word, but it's essentially being their mother, right? Like he has to make sure that all of their clothes are in order, that they're fed, that they're organized, right? Like, and he's like 9/10 of the job is that. And that's a really interesting perspective, that again, yeah, you don't see it in newspapers, right? It's very much relegated to letters, and even when it is involved in memoirs, it's less prevalent. Like letters are where it fully comes out, and my understanding, based on what other people have said and my impressions of it as well, is that that is sort of because of the context of the letter, right? If you're writing to your mom, you are much more likely to adopt a domestic role of son than you will be of soldier, even if the soldier is a major part of what you're doing at that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a very interesting, like I say, dichotomy, right? Because you are fulfilling those two roles at the same time, and
Right.
trying to balance them. Um, Now, this might be a little bit beyond, well, it is beyond the scope of your paper and your research, but I'm wondering about sort of women who serve. Did you research women who serve from Calgary at all, and sort of their motivations, and how that contrasts with this sort of martial identity and their roles in the First World War? If the answer is no, that was beyond the scope. That's fine, but the question came up anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It honestly, it would have been really interesting to focus on. I generally didn't, and the main reason was that in going about the study the way that I did, I really wanted to sort of just lay a groundwork of sort of what are men looking at, how are men interacting with other men, what is the official standard, and sort of compare the two. So yeah, just at the end of the day, it ended up being too much to tackle at once. But if this were ever to develop into a larger project, that would be something that would absolutely be really interesting to look at. And in some ways, I mean, I touched, or I ended up seeing some stuff in my research almost accidentally, just by virtue of the fact that people like Harold McGill, his wife actually was a nurse in England. So she ends up going overseas, and they don't ever explicitly say in the letters that I saw why she did that. But there are issues that come up because of her military service during the war, and his military service that sort of get hinted at. And again, it never made it into the thesis because you can only read between the lines so much, but there was a good chunk of time where letters were essentially getting started with, I know you're mad at me because of that thing I said, but this and XYZ, right? And if you read it, you see that he's kind of frustrated that she is staying like he wants her to be safe back in Canada, but she wants to be in England. So again, sorry, I rambled there a bit, but the end of it is I didn't get to look at it, but I would love to look at it in the future. It would be a very interesting addition to the topic.
And then,
Yeah, sorry,
sorry,
go ahead,
if
Tom.
I can add, like it doesn't specifically answer the question, but in our archives, and you can search on our channel, there is a presentation by Susan Spencer, who talks about the Canadian nurses in World War I. So that dates back all the way to 2021, but well worth watching if you have an interest in that direction.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And I'm just gonna pick up on sort of the theme of going beyond too, and turn back to Megan again. And her second question was, where would you like to see research on the war and gender in Canada? What would you like to see happen next? Where do you think the research needs to go from here? Not necessarily just your own, but sort of the wider study of the war.
Yeah, I think that honestly, and I kind of noted at the top of this talk, but I really think that a good avenue for future research is taking up this sort of mantle of masculinity and pursuing it further. And not that that's the only stuff that should be going on, right? But we've kind of seen in the last 20 or so years, as the social history of the Great War in Canada has really expanded, we've seen studies on like living allowances, women serving in the military, the home front, propaganda. Like we've tackled a lot of different like topics, and it is strange that like in Britain, again, I mentioned it, but these aren't the only ones. There's probably more, but I identified like 5 or 6 full-length studies that are essentially just British men and masculinity in the Great War as a whole, like 1914 to 1918. Here are the studies, and there are different lenses, right? Like there are different focuses, but that's generally what it is. And in Canada, it just doesn't really exist as much, right? Like masculinity is addressed, but I think there would be a really, really interesting study there, because of the nature of Canada, comparing sort of French Canadian conceptions of masculinity and English Canadian conceptions of masculinity, because going back to this sort of regional idea, I don't think that the concepts of duty were absent from French Canada and the notion of masculinity. But obviously, in 1917, you see that French and English Canada have very, very different conceptions of what duty means, right? So I think there would be a really interesting study there to sort of look at on a national scale, what was masculinity like during the war between English Canada and French Canada, and then how much of these differences are just sort of academic and in the sense of, well, it's both duty, but they define duty differently, and how much of it is like a full-on different definition of how to be a man, because that would be a very interesting thing to sort of elucidate from that time period, because of course material conditions between French and English Canada are relatively similar. There are obviously large cultural differences, but we're talking about people living in some cases, only a couple of kilometers apart. So could be a really interesting study to look at.
So
Yeah,
then,
absolutely. And sorry, Tom, just quickly, picking up on that theme, Indigenous concepts of masculinity would be fascinating too. I mean, certainly lots of them served in the war, right? But it would be different again. Sorry, Tom, go ahead.
and kind of continuing to split dynamics here, did you notice, Andrew, particularly Calgary, a frontier town, was there any differences in concepts of masculinity between city men and rural men? I imagine you had a mix of both.
Yes, so there was a pretty healthy mix of both. I never specifically draw any sort of lines between the two, because when I was going through and sort of looking for primary sources, we have a ton of stuff out there, but there's less than you would think based on how many people serve. So I cast a rather wide net of considering a Calgarian to be basically anyone who spent time living in Calgary in the immediate years before the war, including people who, because again, you have lots of instances where guys come to Calgary, they work for a year, they make enough money, they start a homestead, the homestead fails, they come back to Calgary, they work longer, they get more money, they kind of go back and forth, or they live just outside of Calgary, but they're spending like once a week, they're coming into town to grab supplies and whatnot. So I try not to draw like too distinctive a line between those two things. Also because of course, the record keeping from the Great War is really good in some ways, and then in other ways it's kind of a mess. Like it's hard to tell if men lived where they enlisted, or if there's a lot of different sort of changes there that can make it hard to really rigidly classify. But from my general experience, it seems like this was more of a prevalent masculine ideal in cities. Like in rural areas, you have other material realities that make it harder to just sort of up and leave and go and do this thing and you also have less sort of popular culture. There's the institutions are not as strong, right? You're more isolated. So I would probably expect that any sort of hegemonic ideal here is not necessarily as rigidly adhered to. But that being said, some of the most vehement practitioners of the ideal were men from the outskirts of Calgary who, by today's standards, would be classified as a rural Albertan, right? The quote from James Brown about detesting men who, I'm not enlisted at this stage of the game. He was a sort of a rancher from outside of Calgary who would habitually come into the city and worked in the city for a while before settling out there, but is rural in nature. And he was incredibly hardline in his letters home. So of course there's always anomalies there.
All right. Maybe one last question, because I have a 3-year-old's birthday party to get to, but might be a coincidence. This individual has the same last name as you, Michael. He's asking, how did men being married impact the societal impression of masculinity in going to war?
Yeah, it's a good question about marriage. So one of the things that I found is that in general, the pre-war sort of hierarchy started to really villainize bachelors. So before the war, one of the things that you were expected to do sort of as a young man was you were expected to settle down. You were expected to get a job, get married, have kids. And the bachelor, the reason why it became an issue pre-war is because with the rate of urbanization, you start to get more youth unemployment. You start to get people struggling with the economic situations and delaying a little bit their marriage. And so you get these guys who are all going out, they're going to bars, they're going to pool halls, and for the middle class reformer, this is an issue. Like this is a social problem. During the war, that obviously gets flipped on its head a little bit, because with the demographics of men who serve, most of the men who served were not married, right? If you had a wife and you had an established job, you were less likely to join the army because you were already a breadwinner in other respects, right? So there is a little bit of this sort of a flipping of the narratives, but at the same time, again, I wouldn't go so far as to say that the married man sort of lost his status entirely, because one of the things you see in a lot of the propaganda that comes out throughout the war, when they really start attacking men for not enlisting, married men are largely getting a pass. It's basically still bachelors who are getting attacked, and the context of the argument is, people are saying, well, how could married men be at the front while there are still unmarried bachelors at home? There are still these guys without jobs who are delinquents. And, and again, statistically, is that true? Is that a massive problem? Probably not. Probably not as bad as, it might have seemed at that time, but that's sort of how people are making that argument in popular culture. So it's a good question, though.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Nice engagement in the questions, having some questions to bring forward. And Andrew, thank you so much for more fully developing your 3-minute thesis and sharing it with us here in this forum. We really, really appreciate that. So remember, up next, December, Graham Callister, and then we will keep on keeping on with a whole bunch of activities in the new year as well. So thank you, everyone.